Maybe the way we could start this is, Michel, you could say a little more about how you became aware of John and how you became aware of me, and then what motivated you to reach out to us. And then maybe from there, a conversation can just flow.
Yeah. I definitely first discovered John, and I really watched probably 100 hours of your free videos first. And I started with Spengler, then Toynbee, and went on and on. Less the postmodern stuff that you did about 10 years ago. More, I was really focused on civilization. And just on a personal level, I was a minor celebrity in my own kind of environment. So I work around peer-to-peer dynamics in the commons. I've been traveling like 60 conferences a year, at least since 2013. I've been to Yale, Harvard, Sorbonne, the Vatican twice. And, I was in this kind of upward spiral. And I also managed different, Facebook forums some years ago. But then I went into a crisis mode because I got into a conflict around identity politics. And so I have to say, I was entirely on the left. I've been on the left all my life. Not like with a knife in between my teeth or anything, but, just broadly interested in human emancipation. I don't think there should be so much inequality. There's deep issues around climate and biodiversity, and, something is wrong in our system and we need to change it. So that was my basic stance of life. And, old style social leftism. I'm working class. I had a very tough childhood. My father and my mother were working class orphans. My mother was a full orphan and my father half orphan. My mother was functionally illiterate. And when they married, they had nothing. So I had water dripping in our apartment, nothing we could do about it. We had no fridge, no TV. And I was taken away from my parents at 18 months and put in sanatorium because I had asthmatic bronchitis. And I remember things like having to eat my vomit, having nails like this, being in a glass house. I had a really terrible, traumatizing time. It took me until I was late 20s or 30s that I, got out of it. And also my intellectual formation, because I did, I was a Marxist first, then I had to do therapy. I was a Reichian. I lived in the Reichian commune. Then I said, okay, I need to do more. This is not working completely. And I did all the human potential stuff, primal scream and rebirthing. And, I worked with Stanislas Grof.
Have you actually worked with him, or?
I did 2 workshops with him and his wife. Yeah. In the 80s. And, then I got interested in spirituality. My first wife was a sannyasin of Rajneesh Osho. I was in Oregon, in Rajneeshpuram.
Oh, wow.
I did all kinds of stuff. And then I went to Western esotericism. So I've been a Templar, I've been a Rosicrucian, I've been a Mason. And then at some point in my late 20s, early 30s, I thought, okay, I've done enough. And then I did 3 years of philosophy. And then I went in business. So I did 2 startups, internet startups, web consultancies, Joe Firmage, the guy who funded Wilbur. I was a big Wilbur fan. I know John doesn't like Wilbur, but at the time I was really a big
well,
fan.
now it's 2-1. Well, I wouldn't say I love Wilbur.
You both like Wilbur, huh? Yeah.
I wouldn't say I love Wilbur, but I find him very valuable. Some of his models are extremely helpful to me just for situating knowledge.
I rejected him at some point, when he started talking about the mean green meme. But to be honest, with hindsight, he was right and I was wrong. Because what he was saying that something was going wrong in the postmodern universities, right? And at that time, I was a lefty and I said, well, they're not destroying the climate and, you can't blame them. This is the orange mindset, right? But today I would say with wokeism, of which he saw all the premises back in the 80s and the 90s.
Yeah, 30 years ago, yeah.
When you have a big problem and the alternative is totally fucked up, that is a problem. And that's what he saw, what I didn't see at that time. So I would be more forgiving now of what I blamed him for. And so I blamed him for, this kind of neoconservative turn. And then I blamed him for, he makes a lot of shortcuts. Like he interprets things. He says, oh, there's a consensus in that field. But then you talk to the people and they say, no, there is no consensus in that. And that is why I appreciate John's work, because it's all based on the primary material. When you two talk together in those 4 last series conversation, I mean, that's worth going 4 years to the university. There's so much integration and synthesis. Yeah, I just want to say that, I'll kind of maybe wrap it up, is that I saw the whole left all my friends, abandoning me, betraying me, not supporting me when I was canceled. I lost 1/3 of my revenue first and then the rest with COVID.
You should tell the viewers what you did that caused you to become a pariah among these people.
All right. Well, it started with Jordan Peterson. I had listened to Jordan Peterson a few hours, and I put two critical videos on Jordan Peterson. One from the California Institute of Integral Studies and one from Russell Brand, but critical in the normal sense, like that's why we like him, that's why we don't like him. And so I had just said, why is it that when young men and people in general are in trouble, they can't go to the left, they have to go to people like Jordan Peterson? That was my action because I had a mostly left liberal audience. And instead of answering, I got so much hatred. So they were saying things like, oh, he wants to force women to marry at gunpoint, and then I would check it and I say, no, it's actually that claim that says it's in that video. It's not in that video. I listened to it. It's not even in the transcript. This is a complete invention. And I checked 8 different things. And then, of course, because I'm a librarian, before I was in business, I was a librarian. And I just say, well, here's the facts. And instead of having a discussion of the facts, people would then say, oh, you're just a fascist like him and a white supremacist. And I was in total shock because, we can critique the left, and I actually critique the left a lot now. But I'm from a generation where I had Marxist scholars teaching me. These were serious people. They were reading, they knew stats, they would argue, they would recontextualize, but they would not lie. Like Ernest Mandel was one of my teachers. They would not lie. They would not say Jordan Peterson says X when it didn't say, right? For me, it was like the left had descended to the level of the Taliban, the people who hate Salman Rushdie, and nobody has read his book. Anyway, so I had to rethink everything, and that's how I discovered John. And so because I was in COVID, isolation for 2 years in Thailand with my family, I'm pretty happy to be with my family. But given that I was always traveling before, and I was, away from home 7 months a year, when I saw John, I said, this is what I have to do. Go back to the depth, as it were, right? Really look at civilization and macro history. And so I put myself the task, and now, of course, I'm 40 years behind John, to actually read all the macro historians myself now. So I started with Spengler. I'm now doing Toynbee, but I read 2 books of William Irving Thompson. I read the 3 Vergelins on political Gnosticism. I'm reading David Wilkinson on the central civilization hypothesis. So I'm very committed to this. And I'm not coming from zero because I've studied comparative religion for 10 years on my own. I studied 3 years of philosophy, not enough, but it did give me a frame. I read for 3 years back then. And I took a sabbatical of 2 years when I started my P2P foundation work, studying transitions. And so my motivations in talking to you are multiple, which is we need to find a new breed of intellectuals who can talk about the left without distorting it, talking about the right without distorting it, and attempt at looking at relative truth claims wherever they come from. And, when I look at your work, Brandon, and that of John, I thought, well, maybe they don't know the commons that much. And that's something I can bring to your story. Because I do think, having read Peter Turchin's Secular Analysis and, Karl Polanyi, the Lib Lab, Cycle Within Capitalism, I'm pretty confident that there is what I call a pulsation of the commons. And world system analysis talks about phase A and phase B, right? So you have extractive, growth-oriented, conquest-oriented phases, and then it starts disintegrating, eventually collapses. And in the collapse period, what you have is regenerative activities by the people, and then the institution of the commons comes up. And that actually heals those nations. Ecological devastation, the desalination. And paradoxically, this creates a surplus that can then fire up a new growth phase. And so my argument is maybe a bit stark. I'm saying because we are now global overshoot, we actually cannot continue even the pulsation. So we need to move from a state and market-centric civilization. And I see Ukraine as a struggle between the rentier capitalist format of the West and the state sovereignist format of Russia and China. And I think we need a third alternative, which I call cosmolocalization, which is a combination of relocalization, but keeping all the benefits of shared knowledge. There's a really good book by Mark Whitaker about the ecological revolution. And I'll just give you an example. 16th century Japan, all the warlords are fighting each other. Within that, there's a growth of the Pure Land Buddhism Church, which controls about 1/3 of the land. The farmers are armed, and they actually manage it as a commons. They, the Elinor Ostrom rules are applied to the letter. Okay, then the shogun wins. He disarms the farmers. He destroys the Buddhist church, takes the land, but he keeps it as a imperial commons. And so for two centuries and a half, Japan lives within its regional boundaries with a stable population. So that's a good example of the interaction you can have between these commons that were used by the farmers to survive these war-like conditions, and then how a state system appropriates it and changes it. But in this case, in an interesting way, which is not the normal way. Normally, the new civilizations, they just destroy the commons, or they
Right.
appropriate, right? In this case, as happened in China, actually, in the 15th century, I think, they decided to isolate themselves for a while. But so this is a dynamic I'm interested in. And so I'm looking at, both grassroots activities where people are mutualizing a provisioning system because otherwise they can't survive. And at the same time, whether that creates at this stage, like more global institutions. So I have a personal motivation. I'm interested in working with you guys if there is any opportunity. Who knows? Otherwise, no problem. But it's something that I'm interested in. And I'm engaged in the same intellectual project that John has been engaged in. And of course, I'm late to the table. So I'm extremely thankful to John for inspiring this, because it's really what I needed. Something ambitious to structure my intellectual life when I was isolated for 2 years. And Brandon, what you've done, I discovered you independently at first. So what you did with the Mill series, that's exactly what we need, is give voice to people who are being marginalized by the system.
Are you no longer doing the Mill series?
I was denied tenure. Did you know
really?
that, John?
No, I didn't know that.
I mean, I think it was a kind of a similar cancellation type story, because the Mill series, we had Jordan Peterson, and in fact, that was one of our most high profile events. But I think basically what happened, to use Girardian terms, is that I became a scapegoat for the dominant tribe on campus, and they went after me, there just aren't that many martyrs in the world. Most people either join the mob or step out of its way.
There's 1,500 people recorded just this year by fire who've been canceled at academia. So that's actually quite a bit. And, I have the same experience as you, the scapegoating.
Yeah.
And these are active mobs. So what they do is whenever they would know that I was invited somewhere, they would intervene. They would write to them, they would call them, they would email them and say, this guy is toxic, don't invite him. And so 1/3 of my income just disappeared in 2-3 months. And, they do it in secret, because when I have an open conflict, I can actually usually win it. Like most people say, well, yeah, for sure, you're not a fascist. But they do it in the back. And, basically, I wouldn't say destroyed my life, because I'm still here and I'm mostly happy, but it's been traumatic in some other ways, especially the betrayals of friends who don't support you, or who write you private emails, oh, we're with you, but then publicly say the opposite. So I shifted from this kind of angelic vision that most leftists have about, people can change, to a much more conservative vision, because I saw it.
Yeah, actually, the whole experience has given me a much better understanding, I think, of human beings, and also how institutions function, and the incentives that prevent institutions from standing up for someone like me when the facts are pretty clearly on my side. Why it is that successive bodies at Lafayette validated pretty fallacious arguments made by my department, thinking through the motivations of all the parties, because it's not always animus. It could be cowardice. It could be petty career and social.
But it's a purge. We are in a hegemonic. So here's my theory, and John can challenge it if you like. Periodically there is an explosion of differentiation, which can be migration, the barbarians, but can also be too much complexity, or the invention of print, and now the invention of internet. And so the old institutions are not able to channel the ideational glue which holds societies together. So you have fragmentation. Fragmentation creates polarization. And so we had the pagan church versus the Christian church, the Reformation versus the Catholic church. And I think now it's really that. It's the woke and the non-woke. This is at that level. And so one force, the Christians, the Puritans, and the woke, are the forces that want to re-simplify society. So they want less differentiation, to go back to forced unanimity around certain things. and then you have the other forces. And I give you an example. I think capitalism, and I'm a critic, I'm still a critic of capitalism in many ways, but I think capitalism and nation state was a successful attempt to go to a higher complexity level, because you could still be religious, you could still believe, you could still discuss. They didn't abolish it. While the Christians in the 5th century created the dogmas, which eliminated the pluralism of pagan philosophy. And after that, of course, they created the great civilization. But for the first 5 centuries, everything broke down to the most simple feudal fealty. And I think this is a moment like this. And that's why I'm obsessed with woke, even though until 3 years ago, I said, oh, this is a minor problem, a diversion. No, this is it. This is it. This is hegemony.
Revolution.
Yeah, but I think it's not going to work, because it's the PMC, right? The professional managerial class. They're only 20%, and they're alienating everybody else. So it's going to create a reactionary working class revolt, like the Yellow Vest, the Canadian truckers, and the Dutch farmers. It's going to lead to right-wing victories everywhere, which creates its own problems, because most of them are in denial about climate change and they don't care much about the social issues. But I think that, and this is where I've become right-wing in a way, the social right, like the Catholic social teaching, those types of movements, I think represent a balance between the good things about the left and the good things about the right.
Yeah.
So for the moment, that's where I'm kind of like, my sympathies lie, like, I don't know if you know New Polity. I really like their work. They're very smart Catholics, and they read Ivan Illich. They critique Judith Butler, but having read it. So they say smart things about it. They don't just reject it, without, even Jordan Peterson is absolutely not informed about postmodern philosophy. He just says stuff that, he's very smart in his other things, right? But it's not very strong in his
done the reading. See, to a certain extent, Jordan Peterson is a fake, because he starts talking about postmodernism in these very vague, nebulous terms that tell me he has not sat down and read specific texts. He's probably done what everybody does, a flyby reading of Foucault. You read 1 or 2 Foucaults and you think now you know postmodern thinking. No, you don't. It's not that simple. In order to understand Derrida, you have to have already read Heidegger, because I sat down with Derrida over and over again through the years, not having read Heidegger, and could not penetrate Derrida. Couldn't make heads or tails of him. But see, he was a Husserl and Heidegger scholar. So he presupposes Heidegger. And I did not realize that. So it took me forever to understand Heidegger. And I think that Heidegger was probably one of the hardest thinkers for me to figure out. But I finally did by going online and listening to, there was a couple of classroom podcasts of professors talking about the specifics of his work. Heidegger finally clicked. And once that happened, I started doing Heidegger videos on YouTube, because I remember at the time, and this was probably 2008, at the time there was nothing on the internet about Heidegger and how to understand Heidegger, except a couple of superficial interviews with Dreyfus, whom I find a total bore. And there just wasn't anything. And so I thought, after I understood Heidegger, and I got this kind of impression that one of the reasons why there were not more professors explaining Heidegger was because they have this, once again, this is a different elite, but an elitist attitude. We know Heidegger, it's amongst ourselves, we professors, we of the elite. And I said, no, I'm going to democratize Heidegger now. I'm going to proceed to democratize him. So I went onto YouTube, did all these videos. They were a huge hit. But once Heidegger settled in, and now he's one of my all-time favorite philosophers, I'd put him up there with Spengler, then I could sit down and read grammatology, sit down and read Derrida, and I breezed right through it over a weekend. I read it like reading a bestseller. I was like, now this is intelligible to me. It's a whole different story here. So once I did that, and I did that and did a few Derrida videos, but then also I thought it was important to read 1,000 Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari. And that was a book that I only found in a Barnes & Noble, looking at the philosophy section, and this thick tome called 1,000 Plateaus. And I remember looking at it, pulling it off the shelf and thinking, that's a pretty cool title. I wonder what this is about. So it had this aura about it. And then pretty soon I bought the book, took it home. I had been reading a bunch of Paul Virilio and Baudrillard. And so I took it home and I started reading through it, and it was very, very difficult. But at the same time, I was instantly magnetically attracted to it. I could see the erudition and the brilliance here of these guys. Absolutely amazing. So I worked on that text and really delved into it. I probably have read it 5 times, gone back over it and over it and over it. Some of that stuff is really, really difficult. And there are still chapters I don't understand. The chapter on economics and so forth, that's opaque to me. But nonetheless, so then I did those videos, and that was the process, was just being absolutely determined to understand postmodern thinking in a very concrete way by reading the texts and making sure I understand them, and then helping others to understand them as well by democratizing this knowledge. And they'll have some basic idea of, well, okay, I get Heidegger, I get the basics here. I don't know whether I want to read them or not, but at least I understand the basics because Ebert explained it clearly. Without using a bunch of the pretense of a bunch of jargon. And a lot of this academic jargon is a smokescreen of pretense to prevent you from getting into their circle. Once again, it's another one of these elite mechanisms.
I think we're back in the period of the Republic of Letters. So when the Reformation broke out, the university system stopped functioning because they were involved in the fight. The scholastics became superfluous. They couldn't stop the Reformation. So I think 17th century is that all these scholars started writing to each other, writing prefaces and postfaces to each other's book. And that was how the society learned for that period of time. And then it was consolidated in the Royal Academies, and eventually the Prussians reinvented education. And I think we're in the university system is literally being destroyed because you can't even do science. You can't say like there's 2 genders.
Right.
There's like really basic things even in STEM that you can't say. There's just an article I read today. The medical sector is even abolishing exams. So they're creating people that do not know actually medicine just to keep the quotas. The whole society is involved in this, and this is an absolute breakdown of the university system. And so I think smart people are now going to John Ebert and to Michael Millerman, and there's a lot of things happening online where people are following courses. This is where real thought is happening.
My solution to this was just to create my own school, because now there are all these online platforms that enable you to do that, and you don't have to have a PhD to do this, and I don't. I only have a BA in English, because I became disillusioned with academia very early. In that last, probably senior years of college, I discovered Joseph Campbell, and that led me to Spengler and to Carl Jung. And so that opened up a world where I realized if I go through academia, they're going to try to crush this stuff out of me. They're going to try to squeeze my imagination and force me to specialize.
Joseph Campbell is a great example. His work is so incredibly valuable, but he's kind of considered a figure of fun for a lot of...
even Spengler, they consider the dark root of global history. They don't like him. Yeah. And even Toynbee is suspect.
There's a wave of Campbell bashing going on. And I'm not sure where this is coming from. When I read Spengler back in the 80s, nobody was reading him and everyone dismissed him. Now he's the bomb. And it's not just because of me. There are all these other independent people who have mysteriously discovered him at the same time that I was popularizing him. So it's really weird how these things come and go in waves. But right now, there's a lot of Campbell bashing, like for instance, with Jordan Peterson. I read Maps of Meaning, half of it, because I thought it was such a terrible book, and went along, did chapter by chapter analysis on YouTube. And I said, this is just Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and he's not crediting Campbell. And I've heard him bash Campbell, and instead he vaunts Erich Neumann. And Erich Neumann is excellent as well, just as good. The Origins and History of Consciousness. Neumann was a Jungian scholar, and both, again, mysteriously, both Campbell in America and Neumann, he might have been living in Israel at the time, were writing about the hero myth in both of those books, totally independently of each other. And they both came out the same year in 1949, which is pretty mysterious. So Neumann's book is harder to read. Campbell's is easy going. Campbell has the ability to explain very difficult ideas without dumbing them down. Again, kind of like the same thing I do. And so reading him is just a pure pleasure. Plus, he started as a frustrated fiction writer, so he has an aesthetic sensibility that he brings to the prose. He likes it to read beautifully. And it's basically the same idea with the hero myth, the hero's journey, separation, initiation, return. The hero leaves some familiar environment. Luke Skywalker on Tatooine. This place sucks. I know there's a better life somewhere. He finds it. Then he has to go through the ordeal in Empire Strikes Back, this terrible ordeal of being initiated into the underworld, let's say the mysteries of the underworld. And then he returns and comes back transformed, bringing that knowledge back to try to renew the wasteland and make it bloom. So that's the basic myth. And Erich Neumann basically has the same set of ideas. It's just a little harder to read. But Peterson was holding up Erich Neumann and bashing Joseph Campbell, as was Camille Paglia. The exact same thing. Bashes Campbell as just some sort of popularizer who's irrelevant. Absolutely not the case at all. I've read every single word Joseph Campbell ever wrote, his whole oeuvre, and it is brilliant. And let me say this too. Campbell, with regard to academe, he used to compare himself to Mircea Eliade. So Mircea Eliade, he would say, is doing the exact same thing I'm doing, going through the history of all these religious ideas, only he calls them religions and I call them myths. And so if you read The Masks of God, an excellent 3-volume, that's 4 volumes, Eliade's History of Religious Ideas is 3 volumes. It's wonderful. It's excellent, but it's very dry. It's very academic. It's very matter-of-factual. No real imagination to it. It's like he's just a journalist reporting the religious ideas. With Campbell, there's imagination and original ideas.
Yeah.
You will not find a single original idea in anything Mircea Eliade ever wrote. But so Campbell used to say this, and I think he got it dead right, that what I'm doing is popularizing these myths, and Mircea Eliade is the academic equivalent of what I am doing. So it has remained that way to this day, where it's okay, to quote Mircea Eliade, to cite him, but if you cite Joseph Campbell, it's like you farted in the room, and we'll just politely ignore it. So that's sort of what has happened, and that says a lot.
One thing you said about Joseph Campbell that was helpful for me is you said that obviously he's a Jungian, although he does probably place more emphasis on the diffusion of archetypes as distinct from the notion that everyone just has the archetypes.
Versus the collective unconscious.
Yeah, the collective unconscious, right.
Yeah.
But you also said, one thing you said that was helpful for me in terms of relating Jung to Campbell is that you said that when you read Jung, which I've not done, I've only read bits of Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, but you said that when you read Jung, it's just kind of a jumble of archetypes, whereas Campbell just did this incredible job of kind of, from a religious perspective, answering 2 of the questions we've been talking about, namely, what are the great domains across the world? And then what are the great progressions over time? And so the Masks of God, you've got the great domains. And also, I guess the Masks of God does have a chronological element. You've got primitive mythology, and then toward the end you have creative mythology, but even more notably perhaps in the historical atlas of world mythology, you've got the animal powers, seated earth, celestial lights, way of man. He takes all these archetypes and he organizes them in a way that helps the reader place
very concrete.
Yeah,
it's very concrete because of the diffusion idea, because the whole issue is there are 2 ways then to explain why there are so many similarities amongst all the myths in the world. Why do we find the virgin birth, for instance, everywhere? It's not unique to Christianity by any means. So how do we explain that? And so Jung's explanation would be, well, they just come out of the collective unconscious. They're part of the programming. They're part of the instincts of the human psyche, and so that's why. So that's his explanation. And Campbell says, well, wait a minute, but it's interesting that cultures that are geographically contiguous with each other tend to have more similar ideas with each other. Isn't that interesting? So there must be some geographical exchanges that have been going on here. Think of the great Chinese novel, Journey to the West, which is the story of a story of a monk, Buddhist monk and his companions. It's a sort of, and it's meant to be a popular novel, but it's not easy to read. And they're kind of like a Fantastic Four. They have all these superpowers, the pig man and monkey, who becomes very famous. And so they go on a long, long journey to India to get Buddhist Yogacara texts. and bring them back. So there's a concrete example of this kind of diffusionary interchange that has been going on for a long, long time. You have to consider things too, like Campbell points out in the historical atlas, that the old Silk Road was open between 100 AD and 100 BC and 100 AD from Cadiz, Spain to Shanghai, China. And there was all this commerce going on for a very vast geographical extent, but there's also, there's Buddhist monks, there's wandering sannyasins, they're exchanging religious ideas and archetypes all across that, that domain, that old Silk Road there. So Campbell, the great thing about him was that he was able to take these archetypes and concretize them and say, well, no, look here, there's been exchange here. So we have these two different explanations for why religious ideas have all these similarities.
Right, and I'm sure both are true to some extent. Of course, you want to be precise about that, but actually there's a lot at stake there, because it's quite remarkable when an archetype is truly part of the collective unconscious, right? So those are two very different answers. I just wanted to mention, John, I am very close to Cadiz, Spain right now. I am in the Algarve, which is the southernmost region of Portugal. We just got down here from Lisbon, and we're driving across to Cadiz and Malaga in about 5 days.
Nice.
The history of southern Spain and southern Portugal is quite remarkable, because you've got Phoenicians. Before that, you've got Neolithic. Before that, you've sometimes got Paleolithic, but then up to the Phoenicians, and then obviously the Roman Empire, and then the Moors, and then the Christians. And
it was a huge cultural zone of extreme significance, where the Muslims went up in there, and for a while it was Muslim Spain, and they brought all this knowledge. They brought Arabic numerals, alchemy, Aristotle. They were actually Umayyads, and there's Umayyadic Spain, and it was very culturally sophisticated. You had Jews living there as well. So you had Latins, Jews, and Muslims all exchanging ideas until the West decided, well, we're going to take Spain back and get rid of the Moors and push them out. Once again, we're back to the issue here of cultural identity. Being Christian, or is it Muslim?
Yeah.
And so we're going to make this boundary act. Charles Martel had already made a boundary act against the Muslims when they were trying to cross the Pyrenees in, 732 AD, and prevented them. So he created a boundary act and prevented them from crossing. And so Europe was willing to tolerate them because they're on the other side of the mountains, so we don't need to worry about it. But then eventually they decided to push them out. Cultures, I would say, they have these, they're like individuals. They have identities. And when you're an individual and your identity is under threat, either from without or from within, as in the case of schizophrenia, let's say, the identity becomes a very serious issue. You got to know who you are. So it's very important. And so Spain is, it's part of the Western world, and we're not going to let Islam take it. So it becomes a boundary act and a war of two cultures, as it was with the Persians and the Greeks, where the Greeks created a major boundary act there because they already had a very strong sense of identity. We're Greek, we know exactly who we are. When a person has a strong identity, they're pretty much immune to psychological attacks, either from within or without. So identity, it's very important to find it and get it stable. And the Greeks already had a stable sense of identity. They weren't about to let the Persians take them. And so their reply to the Persians in this dialogue was Alexander. So Alexander the Great goes and creates this huge empire. We're done with the Achaemenid Empire. The Persians are no longer a threat. Later, then, of course, there's another backswing when the Muslims come in, and they pretty much take over the whole zone that had once been occupied by Persia and on into North Africa and so forth. So there has been this, all these boundary struggles between the West and the East that have been going on for centuries, century after century after century, each pushing against the other. Now, the mysterious thing to me about that is what exactly is that thing that's doing the pushing against another culture? What is that? It's kind of a mystery, but it has to do with the cultural immune system, in my opinion. That's kind of a metaphor that I use, that cultures, they do have kind of immune systems, and they know when something is an antigen and that's foreign and is not part of self, that needs to be expelled. That's mysterious.
I think it has something to do with the external condition making abundance believable or scarcity. So when you can believe in abundance, you can incorporate more alien elements. For example, the Ottomans were very good with, I think it was called the millet system, where they would just give, other religious communities the right to manage themselves. As long as they paid taxes, they were happy. So in this kind of feeling of abundance, then you can say, oh, you sure we can be different. There's no problem. Once you're under threat, you change from a win-win to a win-lose proposition. And this is what happened, I think, in 2008 with us. Is we had diversity and inclusion, but it was about inclusion. It was about including people. And then suddenly that belief died. And now it's about, oh, you have privilege and I can only advance if I take it from you. And that creates then on the other side a sense of threat as well. So for example, if you're on the social left today, you also lose your job, not just conservatives. I was in a jury, the largest German residency program, and they started by taking all the candidacies that spoke of Habermas and Sloterdijk. Never got an explanation, but these people wouldn't get support, so they were taken out. Then anybody who didn't mention gender and class was eliminated. So if you're a Marxist, and there was a young girl that I wanted to support, she wanted to study how freelancers in Berlin, self-organize against precarity. Oh no, she doesn't mention gender and class. She don't get it. And then the last process was they looked at the bibliography, and if you didn't mention the latest intersectional works, that was another no-no. That meant you didn't really know what you were talking about. So think about this. This is like 1,200 people getting money for the German state who are purely filtered on intersectionality. That's no longer just a battle between different ideologies. This is one ideology saying, and they claim they're integral, right? Intersection is like integral. They're saying, oh, we don't need New Age feminism. We don't need Marxist feminism. We have all that in our intersectional theory. So we don't need you anymore. So this is hegemony, and that creates civil war, because then the other people on the other side feel, oh, there's no more space for me. So I can also no longer accept diversity because I can't exist in your system. So I think that if we would look at the material conditions of history, maybe that explains a lot of why certain civilizations can live with diversity, and suddenly they look at the Muslim civilization, which is very open. And I can't remember exactly when, maybe the 13th century or something, then suddenly it closed. And I think now our Western civilization is closing down.
It's a well-known finding and almost a cliche that during periods of economic scarcity, ethnic groups become more conflictual with each other. They retreat into their ethnicity and it becomes a zero-sum game for diminishing resources. But one thing I wanted to say that supports that is that a lot of the legislation that increased diversity in the United States was passed in the middle of the 1960s, where you're coming up 2 decades of great abundance and rising broad-based prosperity. So I think that supports what you're saying. Yeah. Also, like when you're talking about the informal criteria by which the application committee in Germany made the decisions, I'm reminded when Trump won in 2016, the faculty at Lafayette collectively freaked out and wrote a letter basically expressing their dire concern and discussing the need to organize and mobilize for potential resistance and painting a very bleak scenario of what might happen in the United States. And then there was a lot of boilerplate after that, just about intersectionality. And I remember they always try to hit like every conceivable intersectional identity. So it's like race, sex, like sexual orientation, the trans community, being disabled. And I remember one of the like 9, Muslims, like one of the like 9 things that they mentioned was class. I just thought that was so funny because
they just added at the end.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. I think in the United States, my view is inequality of life and inequality of opportunity rooted in class difference is probably the biggest injustice in the United States today. And what I mean there is, like, if you're born into a poor family, doesn't matter what the color is, the likelihood that you're being born to a single parent in a decimated community with a real poverty of stimulus, of external stimulus, and a lot of bad influences around you in a horrible school system, the likelihood is like pretty high. And if you're born into a pretty well-to-do college-educated family, the likelihood that both of your parents are together, that there's a lot of social capital and civic association where you live, going to a pretty good, it's much higher. That's a huge problem. It's a problem that's been getting worse for 50 years. And what the contemporary progressive left in the United States has to say about that is that it's one of like 10 issues, rather than being a central issue. Actually, when you guys were talking, John, when you were talking, and also Michel, when you were talking, I wrote down like 8 different things that my mind went to. But one thing I'll mention, so Michel, like 30 minutes ago, you said the universities are just being crushed, right? I mean, you described it as a purge. Maybe that's an accurate way to put it. You might call it a kind of slow motion generational purge, in the sense that largely what has happened is that even before the eruption of wokeism, for lack of a better term, in the last 5 years, for 20 years, I think that academic departments have been weeding out at the level of graduate admission and at the level of tenure track appointment people who do not conform to a very specific set of ideas. So in the academic humanities, I think it has been very hard for conservatives to get hired. Tenure is a secondary issue. Just getting hired onto the tenure track is, I think, quite hard for anyone who is openly conservative or simply critical of contemporary left-wing identitarianism. Anthropology, sociology, history, English, comparative literature, increasingly the social sciences like political science and economics. And now it's getting even into science. I can't remember who said this, but someone made a joke that like now scientists are diversity specialists who do science on the side. Or something like that. I'm sure that is not true of many. But anyway, the reason I bring this up, and this is like something I'd like to throw back to you guys, is I read Quigley with great interest. I actually learned about him from John because John did a video on him. And Quigley is very easy to read because his book, The Evolution of Civilizations, is basically like a college lecture translated into a book. I find some of his concepts extremely useful. The notion that vested interests leading to the institutionalization of once vibrant instruments of expansion, that being a fundamental cause of civilizational decline, I think is very useful. But then this idea of when you have an institution, economic, intellectual, whatever it may be, when you have an institution, or as he would say, an instrument that is no longer serving its function, that has ossified into an institution, then there are 3 possibilities, right? There is nothing happens, the forces of reaction win, the forces of vested interests win, and the civilization dies. Or you can have reform and circumvention. And, when I think about the university, and I think we could apply this to many things. We could apply it to contemporary media. I mean, Michel, in a way, your point is that this new ideology, this new meme or virus of critical social justice, I agree with you that the woke against woke dichotomy is fundamental. And I say that because I see critical social justice penetrating the entire Western, or at least American establishment, the entire establishment, academia, media, corporations, sports leagues, any association like the American
CIA, FBI,
everything, right? Oh yeah, the public sector,
World Economic Forum.
Yeah, like the public sector, the private sector, all major civil society organizations, all major kind of checkbook organizations. Okay, so one way to think about it is that our instruments of expansion, knowledge producing, prosperity producing instruments of expansion are institutionalizing along kind of critical social justice lines. Quigley would say, well, here, now you need to decide, and maybe these are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they're not. You need to either reform these institutions or circumvent them, or you're going to die.
So the key for me is analyzing how far we are in the decline. And, I can't really answer that fully. So if you read Peter Pogani, who wrote 2 books about where he says, okay, you have relatively stable dynamic systems and they change through chaotic transitions always. And so chaotic transition means that the old institutions actually have to disintegrate and then something new comes up. So this is not reform. So when you are in a real systemic transition, you actually have to change the institutions. And that's where the commons come in. So, and this is also Toynbee, right? You have the internal proletariat, the empire no longer takes good care of them. So they look for alternatives, and that's where the universal church comes in, right? The loyalties of the people change, so there's self-organized, radical spiritualities in which they try to cope with change. And then you have the nomadic dislocation, and so the external proletariat invades, and then somehow a deal is made. And so the seed forms of the universal church are the form that a new civilization will take. So is that still true today or not? So that's a big question. But one thing that people are doing, for example, I did a study on urban commons paid for by the mayor of Ghent, Belgium, a city of 300,000 people. And so there were 50 urban commons in 2006 and 500 in 2016, a tenfold expanse. So this is 2-3% of the population, young, educated people who say, well, I can't get a house, transportation is too expensive, I can't get good organic food. And so they're organizing these entirely new ways of getting their organic food and, community land trust and co-housing. And this is exploding. So this is what I call the seed funds. But at this stage, they're undercapitalized. So they're still at the marginal stage. What if somehow they could connect with some global alternative form of capital? And so that's kind of what I'm working on, is like, can we have political and economic allies to expand that kind of survival-oriented alternative? So this is the problem. So today, the elite is detaching from the people, and ideological cartels can destroy a society. In 17th century Holland, an ideological cartel convinced the regime to abolish the guilds. The urban proletariat had no longer a reason to fight for the country, and the hegemony of Holland collapsed. So now we have a woke ideological cartel who expanded after Occupy. Occupy was a direct attack, 99% against 1% of the narrative of the neoliberal system, right? And that was super scary. And this is described in a book called Woke Inc. or Woke Capital Inc. And so suddenly you see Google Ngram shows this, like all the press at the same time starts talking woke language. That cannot be just coincidence. Right. So it was like a strategic decision. Oh, we can't go there. So how can we get out of this? And so they saw woke as just as in the 70s, the crisis was there. Keynesians could only say, oh, spend more. It wasn't working. And so they had the Montpellier, a very small group saying, oh, we know what to do. So I think this is what happens now. So they choose the woke cartel because they had developed this theory for 30 years. They were consistent about it. They were schooled in it, and it seemed like a solution. But I think it's a very short-term solution. But what's the alternative? The alternative is we need another elite, and we don't have it. So this is where the conservatives comes in, right? And I'll stop there. So is it believable that a conservative counter-reform takes over from the woke? And I think that's problematic, but okay.
So I was just going to comment on Quigley, because I think his idea about this instrument of expansion, as he calls it, is very important and can be applied to the university, I think, as a whole. So an instrument of expansion is an instrument like, say, feudalism or capitalism that comes into being that expands the society geographically, but also intellectually. So you get these huge periods of geographic expansion and fermentation. And we were talking before about the interaction in Spain between the Arabs, the Jews, Christians. Out of that interaction was born the university system. It can't be a coincidence that all that's going on, and then universities start coming into being around the year 1200 in Paris and in London. They start springing up specifically to study the works of Aristotle, and they're using Aristotle basically as the curriculum for these courses. But all this knowledge that has been absorbed from the Muslims, from the Umayyad Muslims, is applied. So you get the birth of the university as a new instrument of expansion that expands our intellectual horizons. It leads to all kinds of new developments. But now it is at a point, I think, where it has petrified into an institution. And Brandon, what you were saying about the three possible responses, reaction, reform, or circumvention, I don't think it can be reformed. I think it's so far gone that it's just a dead thing. And we're like, people who have discovered, let's say in Jurassic Park, I love using popular metaphors, Jurassic Park, where she finds, the Laura Dern character finds the Triceratops that's dying. And there's nothing they could do about it, but just sit there and watch it die. That's the university system right now. So, but the other possible thing is circumvention. And what I have done is to circumvent. I've gone completely around these institutions to create my own school. So I've created my own online school on the Teachable platform as a means of circumventing a dead institution, which I hope, my hope is that the school will flower and lead to other things. Other people will come in. I'll hire other teachers. We'll have an administration, and it'll become a real school instead of just me talking. But the idea that's the seed, though. You got to start somewhere. So that's my idea for forming a possible kind of intellectual internal proletariat that has seceded from the body social, which is the dominant minority, as Toynbee calls it, because the creative minority that originally brought the university into being was just that, the creative minority. And the creative minority inspires mimesis. Everybody wants to imitate what what the elite's doing. They want to learn and have degrees and write books too. So the mimesis has slowly failed. Now it's the dominant minority.
The minority
create an internal proletariat, an intellectual internal proletariat that's kind of like a mole burrowing up from below. Oh, and me popping my head up into this world and saying, oh, it's pretty. There's a lot of shit down here. You guys should check out these tunnels. You'd really like them.
I mean, this might be useful to just go through really quickly. If we think about the major institutions and then how they've been circumvented in recent years. Now, a great example is media, right? There has been a real hemorrhaging of audience interest from established media networks like CNN and MSNBC and even Fox to organizations that have circumvented those institutions. Actually, Fox News itself circumvented, CNN and MSNBC. And so even though now Fox News gets more viewers than either of those networks, it's not considered mainstream, but it mimics the mainstream in terms of how it presents. Now you've got alternatives to Fox. Now you've got Joe Rogan and millions of podcasts and other media providers. And I, for example, never watch any kind of establishment news. I read some, but I don't watch any of it, even though I do watch a fair amount of news content. I just get it all online and I try to sample the ideological spectrum. So I think that in the media domain, a pretty significant circumvention is underway. Now, with respect to academia, I think if you define academia as higher education, truly, the substance of higher education, thinking really hard and rigorously about very important issues ranging across the disciplines, then higher education no longer exists in the university. So much intellectual seeking and searching is going on outside of the university now. Whereas in 12 and 1300, you had to go there because that's where the books were chained to the lectern. That's why they're called lecterns. That's why a lecturer is called a lecturer. You just read the book. So again, I think the dissemination of information about current events, in other words, the media, as we think about it, that already has been circumvented largely. And most of the people who watch mainstream cable news are boomers, no offense to any boomers. So it seems like that's already been circumvented. Now, academia, it's interesting because even though if you're an intellectual seeker, you very likely are at least going to supplement the academy with your own internet research. But what's interesting is that universities remain very influential.
It's validation. Certification, validation, like you can know things, but if you don't have a university degree, it's not going to be recognized by other institutions. So it affects your economic future.
Very much so. And that's one of the main reasons why students continue to go. They need the credential in order to access the higher rungs of the socioeconomic system. One other thing that these universities have in many cases is insane amounts of money. Endowments that they can fund higher education just on the interest of for a long time.
I see two possible alternatives that I've seen recently. So one is something I know quite well, which is the maker spaces. These are spaces where people think about design, make, and then think about what they make. So we have there a community-oriented third space where people have technology to make things, and they're no longer in the Cartesian split between the managerials and labor. They are a community, and they all think, of course, they're highly educated. This brings to my second point. So I see makerspaces as kind of like seed forms for new type of territorial development. The other thing is St. Joseph College, which has just been created by New Polity. And so here's what I say, and I think John will see that makes sense. So today you're a student, you have to go into debt, and then you come out of university and you're not sure to have a job, you're precarious, by being an assistant for 10 years. So New Polity is educating craftspeople and giving them a philosophical education. Of course, it's Catholic social teaching, so it's like Aquinas, but they teach, about the dignity of work, and at the same time they have a skill. And so as of the second year, they start earning money. So they come out of university with money, with the skill, and with the capacity to think about their life and give it meaning. So these are just two examples of completely different structures than university, which I think is the kind of direction that we're moving in. So, what I've done in my work is always looking at the seed forms, right? So what are people doing to get out of these conundrums? And of course, it's Darwinistic. A lot of them will not succeed. So you have also to look at, a lot of seed forms don't stay seed forms, they just die out. But some of them become permanent. It may sound ridiculous, but think about permaculture. Well, you may think it's marginal, but there are like 20,000 in the world. I don't think that's no longer marginal. This is a remarkable viral expansion of something that seems there to stay and that teaches people systemics, in a very concrete way around agriculture. So I think these are the things that we have to look at and then find a way, okay, what is the part of the elite that can support this, right? Because there's no social revolution succeeds entirely from the grassroots up. So the reason Buddhism disappeared in India was because when the Mughals came in, they killed the monks, so they had to flee to Tibet and Sri Lanka. So when the Mughals weakened, Buddhism didn't resuscitate because they had no elite. And it's the popular Hinduism that recreated a new Hindu renaissance, right? So I think this is a big question. I don't have the answer yet, what part of the elite can be the agent of change? And if you look at the end of the Roman Empire, there was an epidemic of elite Romans giving money to the church because they saw the system was imploding. And by giving money to the church, they could ensure their pension and a place to live and be protected. And so they became the abbots and, actually the leaders of the Christian churches. That was part of the success of Christianity, that it could do that. It could attract these elite people. And then eventually it became the counter society, and the Germanic lords had no other choice than make deals with them because they were organized society. So I'm not sure what the equivalent is today, but this is, I think, what I'm looking for. So what's the universal church today?
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think that the internet here is a game changer. I think that the advent of the internet, because the basic structure of the internet is what Deleuze and Guattari and 1,000 Plateaus call a rhizome. It's rhizomatic, it's not arborescent. The university has an arborescent structure that has a vertical hierarchy like the military does, that you move from rank to rank to rank. That's arborescent. Rhizomatic structures, and there are all kinds of them. Street gang is a rhizome. A pack of wolves is a rhizome. The rhizome in a forest, as opposed to the vertical trees. So we get the internet coming in. It was designed rhizomatically to decentralize. And rhizomes, as D&G point out, are extraordinarily tough to eliminate. As anyone who, like I did in my previous place, was fighting ants constantly because they're a rhizome. They don't have a center. They're all sort of horizontal, and they're extraordinarily tough and very difficult to destroy. So I think we have the internet coming in designed as a rhizome, and it is now having a disintegrative effect on the university as an institution. And it may be where the new instrument of expansion comes from the internet, with individuals like me, who it has without a degree. When I left college after my senior year and decided not to pursue a degree, I knew I was going to have money problems my entire life. I knew that without a degree, and indeed I have had. But nonetheless, I was persistent. So I founded my own school online. We've got Michael Millerman, who has also founded his own school online. We've got other individuals like Justin Murphy, whom I taught a class for on Carl Jung about 2 years ago. Justin Murphy is another example with his Indie Thinkers platform of a professor about your age, Brandon, who PhD and everything, decided to leave academe, roll the dice and leave it. After conversing with me a few times about, what's my experience been like with self-publishing, which is again another circumvention, because I think publishing is also a dead institution. And it's not, all these things came into being at the same time in the 12th century, manuscripts, and then of course eventually in the 15th century with the printing press. But they're all part of the same Gutenbergian world that is in full tilt disintegration. And I think with the internet, it opens up new possibilities for individuals for whom it doesn't matter if they have a degree or not. It doesn't, their background doesn't matter. It's a public platform. It's a new lectern. Let's say it's an electronic lectern that you plug yourself in, turn it on, voila, here's my own school. Students will show up, especially if you've got something to offer, as I do, and as Michael Milliman does, that the universities don't. And the people who show up now, the students I had in my first class, it was about 20 kids, Michel was there, were people who were there because they wanted to learn. They weren't there for a degree. They weren't there. I find this very significant. These are that percentage of college kids that I mentioned who are interested in actually learning something and not just in having a degree so they can go get a job. They're here on my school to learn. And it's working. We're up and running with our second class on understanding mythology, and it's working very well. We've got about 15 students in that one. We're going to do a course on the novels of Cormac McCarthy next. So we're going to go through his novels, and I anticipate a very large turnout for that, especially since McCarthy lives out here. This is his world. It's Santa Fe, it's McCarthy world.
I just wanted to mention, since we're on Cormac McCarthy, I started reading Blood Meridian a few months ago. I stopped about halfway through, just not because I wasn't enjoying it, because I actually really enjoyed it. It was almost like being completely transported to another world through his atmospheric poetry prose.
Yep. I had the same experience with Blood Meridian, where I think that was the first one I read, and I too stopped at about the halfway point, thinking, wow, this is so overwhelming. It's like such a saturation of knowledge and information that I don't fully understand. So I need to go understand the background of, you know, the whole situation in that novel. And then when I did the background research,
made a little more sense.
Mexican-American War, yeah, and so forth. It came in crystal clear, and I began to appreciate the richness of that book. So I've read it a few times now since then.
But continue.
Absolutely incredible. But yeah, so no, I've made my point basically that I think the internet is the new instrument of expansion, where we're going to see a new creative minority spring up, and they're going to pose a huge threat to the autonomy of the university system. The internet's still new. We haven't even begun to see the possibilities of what it's going to do. And when that wave hits over the next decade or so, we're going to see a whole intellectual transformation in this culture and this whole society globally, not just in America or in the West, but globally, because the platform is open to everyone and anyone who wants to create their own schools and has the courage to do so and isn't worried about the stigma of it. When something new comes along, very often it's viewed with a stigma. Oh, self-publishing, that's ridiculous. Self-publishing is, that's a vanity thing. Not anymore, it isn't. Amazon has opened up a whole new door, and I have converted professors to self-publishing. My friend John Lobel now self-publishes routinely on there. He's a major academic who's been around forever. Other artists, other individuals, I believe Justin Murphy decided to go with self-publishing after talking with me. So I've converted a lot of people to it because, once again, the publishing industry is a dead institution because now it's only about money. It's no longer, there's no way a Joseph Campbell or a William Irwin Thompson could be published today. So the publishing industry is dead too. And so once again, though, this is going through the internet, this whole self-publishing horizon, which I foresee to be the future of publishing, in addition to the founding of these individual schools. So I think I was initially nervous about the internet back when I was watching it develop, and I was critical of it in my book, The New Media Invasion, but I've since come to have a different attitude. Now it's my all-time favorite medium. I think it's the greatest medium that has ever been invented, because we take McLuhan's comment that the content of a new medium is a previous medium, such as, for example, the content of the publishing industry were the illuminated manuscripts. The content of film is the novel. The content of, and on and on and on. The content of the internet is all previous media since the writing of Gilgamesh on these cuneiform texts. It's all in here, everything. So it's totally all inclusive, and it's amazing. So, and that is extraordinary power. That is just to have control over media, because media is what controls civilization. You have to master writing in order to make civilization happen. So media is absolutely one of the key instruments of creating a vibrant civilization. Writing, mathematics, everything depends on media. And so here we have now the ultimate medium, this all-inclusive medium that is going to show us marvels.
I think this is what the next civil war is about, as it were. So we have this extraordinary invention, and then we got, like they imposed on it, on the original peer-to-peer structure, imposed the client-server architecture, and then, the business and government control. And today, if you're on Facebook, Twitter, these are no longer free speech platforms. You have to be careful about everything you say. They have all these algorithms, and so they're trying to suppress it. And I agree that they won't be able to fully. But what you see already is that the right wing, which is the main target of censorship today, they're going away. They have their own locals and what is it called, Gap, and I don't know them very well. So this is happening right now. So what they're doing is, like, because they lost control of mainstream media, but they still use the mainstream to repeat the narrative all the time, the same narrative, and then they use the algorithms on the social platforms to make sure that you don't hear the other, right? Especially like on chosen topics like Ukraine, COVID, trans issues. Like, you just can't say a lot of things, including just stating facts. It's impossible to state simple facts. They kick you out.
Just to add to that, because it's a great point, Michel. And of course, one problem with the internet is the network effect, meaning that the first to the market has a monopoly. And then, so then if some interest can capture the monopoly, then effectively you're sort of turning the rhizome into a tree.
However, this is something I wrote about in the New Media Invasion called the Hydra effect, where, and there I use the example of the Hitler video that they had from the movie Downfall about him, where they have, it's copyright stuff, right? But they have all these individuals, he gives a rant in there, and they have individuals that reprogram the rant to like make him sound like he's ranting about how his fingers are too big for his cell phone. And absolutely hysterical. And the owners of the movie kept taking it down, and it kept springing right back up, because there again, that's the rhizomatic decentralizing power of the internet. No matter how many of these monopolies like Twitter or Google show up, there's always going to be a billion others that can show up and will show up to decentralize their power.
One question we might talk about another time is, I think it's hard to argue with you, John, that in the long term, the rhizomatic nature of the internet will corrode the arborescent institutions that still constitute the establishment. But then the question is, will the rhizome also corrode society itself?